Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson, and if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate the show. That helps people to discover it on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, and it's also on Rumble. Enjoy the episode.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, Matt, thank you for joining me. I really do appreciate your time today.
Happy to be here with you, Ryan.
Yeah, I've been exploring your ideas for some time now, and I really love your Footnotes to Plato YouTube series. I've been really enjoying that, and then I've listened to you on some podcasts, probably like 5 or 6 different interviews that you've been on, and some of your reading, or I've been reading some of your work as well. And I thought it would just be really nice to explore consciousness with you and expose you to more people. I think it would be nice for people to hear some of your perspectives on cosmology and just the way that you think about the nature of consciousness. So here we are. I'd love to maybe introduce you to the audience and give people a little bit of your background, if you don't mind, and maybe what you're currently doing as an associate professor at the college. So,
yeah, well, I teach process philosophy and German idealism at this wonderful university in San Francisco called California Institute of Integral Studies. It's a special place. Maybe some of your viewers, listeners, have heard of Alan Watts. He was the first dean of the prior institutional incarnation of CIIS. At the time, it was called the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco, and that was back in the 50s. And Haridas Chowdhury was the first president. He came over from India, hand-selected by the Indian revolutionary turned yogi Sri Aurobindo. And so I teach in this university that has that origin story in the San Francisco Renaissance, in the counterculture, in that moment when East met West in a really big way. And so I feel very lucky to be able to teach in that institutional context. And a lot of my scholarship is and my thinking in public. I mean, I'm kind of I have one foot in academia and one foot in the online sort of para-academic space, or just the public intellectual space. And a lot of my work is trying to bridge between the natural sciences, the humanities, and spirituality, and to really take the meaning-making pursuits that we human beings engage in seriously. And to take that pursuit seriously means, I think, to be as up to date with the various scientific disciplines as we can be, but also to put science in a broader humanistic context, which is to say science is a cultural activity. Scientists are motivated by their interest in the truth. That's a value that scientists hold, and you can't scientifically explain away that value in truth. You need philosophy to contextualize why we even think science is important, And so I'm trying to bring all these pieces back together, because I think in the modern and postmodern world that we live in, things have gotten kind of fragmented. And so for my own sake, and maybe for others' sake, I'm trying to bring some coherence back to these different spheres of our lives.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear how we got so fragmented, in your opinion. And then before that, I'd love to go back in time and hear what your initial belief systems were growing up, and like how you grew up and how you became so enamored with philosophy to where now you're teaching it and sort of obsessed with it to some degree.
Yeah. Well, I was a quiet kid. I liked observing. I found adults really interesting. because it seemed like, I would notice all of these subtle subtexts that, like, people didn't talk about certain things so I just got very curious by sort of social reality, and I didn't know what I was doing really, but as a 8-9-year-old, I would listen on my Walkman to Enya, and sort of have these out of body experiences,
Wow.
sort of floating into the cosmos. And music can function as a kind of psychedelic drug, really, especially if you're just a 9-year-old. And so those early experiences, I think, primed me to become philosophical as I aged. I was experiencing wonder, I think, and became a bit of a wonder junkie, as it were.
Cool.
And I didn't really know that there was a world of philosophy that I could explore in a whole history of ideas until high school, when I had a really influential teacher that exposed me to that history. Alan Watts, I started reading in high school, and Carl Jung, and some Friedrich Nietzsche, though I didn't understand it at the time. And so I shifted out of a more or less atheist point of view in my early teens, because I got into science and Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking, and thought that religion was pretty silly. But then as I got towards my later teens, and I'd been exposed to people like Jung and Watts, I realized that there was more going on in religion. And so from about the time I started as an undergraduate, I had already realized that I couldn't take sides in, say, the science versus religion war or something. I felt like there needed to be a more integrative perspective on those questions.
And while that was going on, did you have you said, you sort of had this out-of-body experience at a young age at 9. Did you also then in your teen years or in your early college years, I don't know when it was that you started to explore psychedelics or non-ordinary states of consciousness through different means, maybe breath work, yoga, things like that?
Yeah, during my undergraduate years, so 18, 19, I started to get really into Buddhism and was meditating. And I was also listening to a lot of Terence McKenna lectures. And, he started to say, yeah, meditation's fine. But, if you really want to get there, just eat 5 grams of mushrooms. And so eventually I tracked some down. And at 19, had my first psilocybin experience. And that just blew the lid off of my conception of reality, and actually led me from not to give up Buddhism or meditation, but I was quite shocked and surprised to have an experience of Christ in that first mushroom journey. And I didn't convert to Christianity or anything, but it did bring my attention back to a tradition that I, obviously growing up in the U.S., my mother is Christian, evangelical. My father's Jewish, but I kind of ran away from the Abrahamic traditions because it didn't seem to speak to my experience until this psilocybin journey. And so that brought me back to a more careful study of kind of the esoteric and mystical lineages within Judaism and Christianity, and so that's been an important part of my path since then. So I don't know. Cool. I've heard more and more people, because of psychedelic experiences, being brought back to Christianity of some form, not a fundamentalist sort of Christianity, but rediscovering it as a result of some direct encounters that they have in the psychedelic state. And so it doesn't seem like that uncommon, but I was pretty surprised at the time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So at what point did you get into Alfred? Whitehead's philosophy and start realizing that that was something that you really resonated with? And why do you resonate so much with it? Can you describe that?
It was actually Terence McKenna who also dropped Whitehead's name for the first time. And I read a chapter in one of McKenna's books. I believe the chapter is called Organismic Thought. I think it's in his book Invisible Landscape, if I'm not mistaken. And that organic way of understanding the whole universe, not just the biological world, but the whole cosmos as this evolutionary process, as a kind of network of ecological relationships, was really compelling to me. It reminded me a lot of the Buddhist idea of dependent co-origination, or the idea of Indra's net, this kind of holographic view of the universe. And so I was definitely drawn to Whitehead based on what McKenna was describing. But the more I looked into it, I discovered warnings, basically, that he's very difficult to understand. He starts as a mathematician at Cambridge and then works with Bertrand Russell on this logical treatise, the Principia Mathematica, which is totally unreadable, and eventually makes his way through the philosophy of physics into metaphysics later in his life. He moves from England to the other Cambridge, Massachusetts, to teach at Harvard when he's in his 60s. And so I didn't study Whitehead formally until graduate school, and took some courses where we were able to dig into his books. And that was around 2008, so like 18 years ago, almost 2 decades ago, and I have not stopped reading and rereading those books because Whitehead's texts, and maybe it's true of any really deep philosophical text, it's a bit like a psychedelic drug. It alters your perception. It just takes a little bit longer to kick in. Like, you have to read and reread and reread, and the difficulty of Whitehead's text is that he's not just thinking the same old thoughts that we're used to. He's thinking new thoughts and contorting language to express those new thoughts. And so until you learn to speak his language, you can't quite see the world in the way that he's seeing it. But once you do, you can't go back. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk a lot about Pan-Experientialism, and could you just describe a little bit about what that means? Because I know a lot of people have probably either never heard of it or they have a wrong impression about what that means.
Yeah. Some people maybe have heard of panpsychism, and Pan-Experientialism is a Whitehead's specific version of panpsychism, I would say. So panpsychism is, pan meaning all and psyche meaning soul. That in some sense, psyche goes all the way down, soul goes all the way down. Now, the problem with the term panpsychism is usually we think of, animals have a kind of soul, human beings have a kind of soul, this interior consciousness, conscious awareness. Maybe plants have souls, but even there's already a sense that we need to make a distinction that, like, okay, plants are sentient, but they don't move around. They don't seem to be like motivated to go do stuff, and they're kind of locked in place. They grow, they respond to light, but there's a little bit of a diminishment of interiority, it seems. And so Pan-Experientialism is just an attempt to say there are modes of experience that do pervade the natural world, not just to the level of plants, but even into crystals, even into atoms and quarks. But it's not conscious experience. It's not experience that is aware of itself experiencing. It's just kind of blind emotion. So, Whitehead would say that electromagnetic radiation is not just, as physics would encourage us to believe, a bunch of numbers crunching themselves out there, just a mathematical equation. No, it's there's something it is like to be a ray of sunlight. What is it like to be a ray of sunlight? I think the closest we can get to imagining that is feeling that ray of sunlight on our cheek. Now, obviously, that's filtered through our own modes of experience as a living organism made of trillions of cells and a complex nervous system. But I think we can at least begin to intuit what it is like to be a ray of sunshine by feeling the warmth on our cheek.
Mm-hmm.
And so Whitehead's Pan-Experientialism is inviting us into a view of the natural world that doesn't divide mind from matter, that doesn't think that somehow mere matter, just a bunch of external surfaces colliding, could ever have generated mind or consciousness or experience, that we need to look again at nature and not separate conceptually what, in terms of our direct encounter, is never separated, right? We're never outside of experience. And that can sound idealist. Whitehead's not an idealist. But if we're able to generalize from our own experience, we have a direct example of what it is to experience the world from the inside out in our own experience. And Whitehead's wager, his invitation, is to consider that every organized physical system in the universe has an interior horizon of experience of some kind. Maybe not conscious and self-conscious like ours, even though we're not self-conscious or even conscious most of the time. But maybe our form of experience can be generalized such that we recognize it throughout the natural world.
That's really well described. And I talk to a lot of scientists through this podcast medium, and a lot of them have different ways of viewing the world and the nature of consciousness. But a lot of the modern current scientific models seem to remove, and I've heard you speak to this, the subjective and existential component to it, and the lack of understanding that we have of the nature of consciousness. So we're so quick to, like, I have Lawrence Krauss coming on. He was supposed to be on this last week, but in about 2 weeks or so. And I like listening to him speak because he's a brilliant guy, but he's very quick to just dismiss all spirituality and all religion and all this stuff as just completely silly, you know. And I'm sure you've heard him speak, and people like him because you said you read Dawkins and Hitchens, and I went through all of those guys early on too to try to completely smash my ideas about religion, to then build up from the bottom up and see what was left. And similar trajectory as you, but not nearly as in-depth in reading Whitehead and all of these philosophies. I think of it more as contemplative practice and meditation and experiential. And some of the first experiences I had, like you, were this cosmic perspective that you can experience, where you realize that you aren't separate from the universe and that you're experiencing the universe in this weird way, but you can almost have a cosmic experience and then come back into this little flesh vehicle and go back to work and enter the matrix and navigate your life. But what do you do with that experience, and how do you even go about approaching the scientific models? Like, if I was to go and explore cosmology or explore through telescopes and things like this and look at space, I have to always remember that this is just a tiny little interpretive lens that I'm using, because I still don't understand the thing that I'm looking through the telescope with. So I don't know. I think that, where do you think that science went away from spirituality and spirit, and we sort of divided the two, and we stopped infusing it? Because all the early scientists were pretty spiritual beings, and then all of a sudden it just drifted away. So where did that diversion happen? Because we started there in the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, well, I think to approach that question requires an analysis of the evolution of consciousness and the way that human beings over hundreds of thousands of years gradually transitioned out of a mode of relationship to the cosmos where meaning sort of streamed into us from the outside, and there was less, safer primal peoples prior to like agriculture and when we're just living more in attunement to the natural world around us, there was less of a sense of an interior consciousness that was separate from the natural world. There was more porousness, and there nowadays anthropologists, or at least maybe in the 19th and early 20th century, anthropologists would look at what they called primitive cultures and say, oh, they're animists, which means they're projecting their own human social relationships and meanings onto the natural world, which we now know as modern scientific materialists is just a bunch of dead stuff. I think actually the projection is the modern scientific materialists. They're the ones who are projecting that dead mechanistic view of nature, and that really the truth of the matter is that the universe is alive and that we're alive because we're derived from that cosmic life. But the evolution of consciousness proceeded in such a way that we became more and more cut off from that cosmic meaning that was streaming in and just obvious. And it's still obvious to young children, right? Mm-hmm. Even today, that we have to teach them not to be animists. And I think people like Krauss or Dawkins or whatever, they say religion is child abuse because we're imposing something. And I think to some degree there are forms of fundamentalist religion that are impositions upon that instinctual animism that children possess, and so I'm not totally dismissing what the sort of new atheists were trying to do, but I think that there's a deeper form of participatory consciousness, say, that was evident in all primal human beings, and we still see a glimmer of that in children today. And that what happened around 500 years ago in Western Europe is this the scientific revolution, right? Where there was a new mode of consciousness that was experienced itself in a far more dualistic way, and there's something tragic and there's a major loss that occurs there, but there's also something gained, which is a sense of inner freedom. Human beings, after the scientific revolution, increasingly experienced meaning as something they had to produce. We have to bring it forth. It's not just given to us by the cosmos. Mm. And so there's a relationship between this new scientific orientation where we treat nature as a machine that we can come to know, predict, and control, and the political sense of being an individual with rights and freedoms and stuff. I think those two transformations are actually connected, right? We needed to mechanize and disenchant nature and create what there's a philosopher named Charles Taylor, he calls the buffered self. We needed to buffer our inner experience from this radiant meaning that primal people experienced that in some sense didn't allow for much freedom. Mm. We lived in a very compact society prior to modern science and the political revolutions where we were expected to play a role that we just fit into the existing social structure. There's no freedom of individuals to decide how to make themselves, So there's a gain and a loss, but it's this evolutionary process where it's not just new ideas that we're coming up with. Our very perception of reality is shifting through this evolution of consciousness. Mm. And so we've gotten to a point now where that individual freedom has become a bit exaggerated. We're too individualized and we're so cut off from nature. And this mechanistic image of nature, it's not just a way of seeing, it influences our behavior and how we relate to nature. And so we're in the midst of a mass extinction and an ecological catastrophe because our image of nature it's not accurate. The earth is a living community of organisms, and we've been treating it like a bunch of raw material that we can just use however we see fit, and so we're killing it. And so now, having gone through this whole evolution of consciousness, I think there's a need to reintegrate what has been severed, not to return to where we were, but to become conscious participants in cosmic meaning, right? Rather than just having it given to us, now we can, out of our own freedom, reunite with these deeper currents of value that are not just human constructs, but actually natural, cosmic, right? So
it's a
hopefully that
severance
story makes some sense.
No, it makes
Yeah.
a lot of sense, and it's like we've basically lost or forgotten our connection to nature and realizing that we are nature and that the planet and everything around us is not separate from us. And then we got this mechanistic, linguistic construct that we somewhat glorify instead of... So we use language, and language started to shape, and we got sort of attached to the maps and forgot the actual territory a little bit of... It's almost like we worship the maps and the language, and that's somewhat egocentric to a degree. It seems like in the West, at least, we're technologically driven and we're all about success and momentum, and we have this... I guess we inherit it. I mean, I inherited it as you did. We have this idea that we're supposed to come up in our culture and everything's monetary, and there's consumerism and capitalism, and your status goes up if you make more money so you can buy more things. But if you were to go to the Amazon jungle deep enough in, you see people running around barefoot, and they don't have any clue about these ideas. So a lot of it, that cultural context, is so much of what shapes us. And in the West, it seems like we've really doubled down on the mechanistic models. But I'm wondering what you think about like ancient civilizations now that we're rediscovering how much older things are and how much more advanced we might have been throughout different periods of time. And it seems to me, from what I'm gathering at a really low resolution view, that there was peaks of maybe advanced versions of ourselves thousands of years ago, and then there was a collapse of some form, whether it be a natural disaster or some catastrophe. And then we've forgotten our past to some degree, and we're trying to piece it all together and, make way. And I feel like it might happen again in our lifetime or in the next, few decades if we don't get our act together.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I mean, if Homo sapiens have been around for 300,000 years, I think is the most recent estimate, based on archaeological findings. It always struck me as odd. I remember the first anthropology course I took as an undergrad, learning that we've been anatomically human and as Homo sapiens for 300,000 years, and yet for 90% of that time, we weren't even making art on cave walls. Like, there was just nothing going on. We're just wandering around aimlessly in the woods. Like, I don't think that's true. And of course, there are multiple ice ages that came throughout that period that the glaciers would have wiped away any evidence of major settlements or cities or structures. So rather than assume just because we don't have evidence or very little evidence, increasingly there is some evidence of these ancient civilizations, maybe we could just recognize that the evidence would have been destroyed by these ice ages. And I think the question is, what do we mean by advanced civilizations? We have a particular view of what it is to be advanced nowadays that has to do with technologies that are of a particular form, materialistic, mechanistic technologies. It could be that earlier civilizations had their own forms of technology, but they're not the sort of things that could leave a fossil trace because they were subtler technologies. And I think our modern technological civilization needs to take a big bite of humble pie and recognize that there's so much that we've lost as a species, as much knowledge as we've gained in the last several hundred years as a result of this scientific method. And I think that's beginning to happen as indigenous lifeways are becoming more respected and acknowledged and honored. Traditional ecological knowledge alongside of modern scientific knowledge. I think that's a very interesting sort of dialogue that's taking place. And, the other thing about modern mechanistic science is there's a kind of irony in that, as you were saying, all of the early scientists, Newton and Galileo and Descartes and Kepler, they were all theists. They were all, for them, that the fact that nature obeyed these mathematical laws, that the human mind could decode, was the best evidence you could ask for that this was all created by God. So somehow, all the way up to like Immanuel Kant, who dies in the early 1800s, the mechanistic view of the cosmos was upheld as really the most powerful evidence for the existence of God that one could ask for. And then I guess Darwin is the one who really changes that. All of a sudden, mechanistic accounts of nature become the best proof that God doesn't exist. That's an example of how consciousness evolves, right? Within the span of less than a century. But the point there is just that the idea of a mechanistic cosmos originates in this kind of deist philosophy where there is an image of God as an engineer or a mechanic or a mathematician, right? Why should nature be so lawfully ordered? Why are there laws of physics, And so physicists like Lawrence Krauss obviously want to say, oh, we don't need God, we just have the laws of physics. But where did the laws of physics come from? I mean, why is nature intelligible to us at all? These are deep questions that I think, if you're honest about them, lead you in a theological direction.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean in a direction where God is imagined like the Old Testament imagines Yahweh, or that we need to imagine God as like a separate from the universe and designing it from the outside or something. But there are many different forms of theology that we could point towards. But I think the deep question of why is nature intelligible and what are the conditions that make scientific investigation possible in the first place, it warrants, I think, more reflection on what we might mean by God. I think there's a theological, certainly in the origins of science, there's a theological basis there. And so the fact that science has forgotten its origins in a particular theological view is a source of a lot of confusion nowadays, I think.
Yeah, and I've heard you speak to the idea that the ecological collapse that we're witnessing is a metaphysical problem. And the world is becoming more and more centralized. There's more and more centralization of power and more amplified exponential growth of technology. So the power becomes a little bit more it's huge. It's become amplified to a certain degree where it can be used in such harmful ways without even knowing what the unintended consequences are. Sometimes the hubris of people to try to manipulate weather or viruses or you name it, cities, and even the way that they try to shape ideas and institutions. So like social engineering, things like this are so much more prevalent and easier to see deployed into the meat space. And people, the average person that's trying to keep their head above water because the society is built on this momentum and trying to pay your bills. I mean, I ride around on a fire truck and I get to see the grounded, rooted nature of things just on an everyday basis. And these people don't have time to ponder the nature of God, let alone the nature of the social engineering system that's been imposed upon them. They're just trying to get by and get a big gulp, half of these people, and have a decent day. And so when I see like the practical grounded version of reality, and then I like to go, because I'm lucky and I have time and space and a decent hardware system that allows me to just have time to contemplate the nature of reality, just free time. What a luxury. You start to just ponder the nature of suffering. That's where my whole orientation comes from when I try to study philosophy or learn about the nature of consciousness, is also like, how can we take some practical elements of what we're learning about and triage what would be the best thing to do to get 80% of people's head above water in a short period of time, if possible, while also trying to, so what I'm curious about, I guess, is the nature of suffering in relationship to this situation, the circumstance that we're in, where we have so much centralization of power. And do you think, like, I would love to know your current perspective on where you think this thing is going and what you think is the biggest problems and what would be the most practical solutions for us as a species and as individuals. It's a big whopper, of course, but you're a smart guy that likes to contemplate these things too. That's why you study philosophy, I think.
Yeah. So I think that centralization of power is actually downstream of a particular image of divine power. Our political ideas, and I'm borrowing actually from a Nazi political philosopher here who I disagree with where he takes this, but I think he's right to point out that modern political philosophies are just secularized theology. And so this idea that it's good to centralize power because then you can keep things more organized and efficient and whatever, that's a very monotheistic idea of power. And it assumes that the universe, that nature or that human society could be controlled in a top-down fashion. And that is, if you take like complex systems science seriously, like these new forms of science that aren't so dualistic and mechanistic anymore, system science, complexity theory, chaos theory, you recognize that, nature is highly ordered, but it's a very distributed form of order that emerges from stochasticity. It's the fancy word for sort of not random movement, but every part of nature is just doing its own thing, and out of that, those individual creatures doing their own thing, larger forms of organization just emerge of themselves in a very decentralized and distributed way, and nobody's in charge of it. There's no engineer looking in to make sure that everything's working correctly. It just it works. But to say that it works doesn't mean there's no suffering and death. Death isn't an accidental part of life. It's essential to life. If you're alive, you're going to die. It's just the way it is. And I think we've built up this image of power in the modern world, which we think is rooted in secular ideas, but it's really a hangover from, I think, a very unfortunate set of theological images, which, and Whitehead's very good at pointing this out. This idea of God as a Caesar or the emperor or whatever is a function of, I'll say, primitive imagination projecting very hierarchical social situations onto, this image of the divine, and imagining God in the image of an imperial ruler. What's compelling about Christianity for me is the way in which it says, oh no, God was just this fragile human being that the emperor or Caesar executed. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very different image of the divine as Whitehead would say, a fellow sufferer who understands the human condition. Now, I think all the world's religions offer us some insight here that would disabuse us of this view of power, as if centralizing power and control is the way to keep things peaceful or working efficiently or to minimize suffering. Actually, it maximizes suffering. And we can't escape suffering, but we can certainly work with it in a way that doesn't intensify it. And I think in our neoliberal capitalist society, run by transnational corporations, that a corporation is legally required to function as a exploitation and externalization machine, right? To exploit workers, to extract labor power and creativity from workers, to siphon all of that value to a few shareholders, and then whatever waste is produced just gets externalized, whatever social costs just gets externalized. That whole system, I think, is based on a faulty social Darwinist understanding. And this isn't Darwin's fault. This is the fault of the ways in which this view of evolution was received and understood by the people in charge of our societies as a justification for capitalism, as if nature is itself capitalist, and so human society should just mimic nature as just competitive struggle for existence. I think Darwin is more nuanced than that, certainly. Though even in Darwin, his views of the natural world were derived, they were downstream from Ricardo and Adam Smith and Malthus and these ideas from economics. So it's a very interesting thing that happens here where, I was talking about the anthropologists who say that primitive people are projecting their social relationships, the way that human beings relate to each other, onto nature, which is just this dead stuff. Well, Darwin is borrowing these ideas for how human economies work and then projecting that onto nature. And so if you apply the same logic, like who's doing the projecting? But I don't want to blame Darwin for any of this. I think Darwin was brilliant, and it's more the ways in which we've been led to believe that our human economic system that's dominant now, at least this capitalist system, is natural, as if nature is just a competitive struggle for existence among separate individuals, which is not the case at all. There's as much symbiosis and cooperation in the natural world as there is competition. There is competition, but that's not the whole story by any means.
Right. Yeah, sometimes it's really hard to understand the nature of things when you get into learning about how the Rockefellers funded some of the education system, and then you have the Flexner Report, and you have just this giant profit desire, this desire for power, and it leads to a giant social engineering project that we don't know we're really a part of until you get older and older, and it's almost too late. But you start to see that there is some form of control mechanism being imprinted into the consciousness of the masses to keep playing this game out. And so I've always been really fascinated with things like MK Ultra and some of the CIA's programs and Operation Paperclip, and because when you start to explore consciousness, especially things like psychedelics, you're like, wow, if everybody just ate mushrooms, we'd be better. That was my initial thought years ago, naively. But then you start to find out how they can be used for persuasion and, putting people into suggestible states. And now what I'm seeing is more of the Brave New World scenario playing out, where everybody's being infused with this idea of healing using psychedelics and trauma culture. Right. And so I'd love to hear some of your perspectives on that, because it's such a huge part of our shaping of our consciousness right now, this psychedelic renaissance and the social engineering projects at hand.
Yeah, no, I was just like you, as an undergrad, learning about the 60s counterculture and the role that psychedelics could play in that sort of social transformation. I was very naive about it. Everyone who studies that time period in their late teens or as an undergrad or whatever tends to think, oh, man, if only we could get acid in the water supply in Washington, D.C., we could solve all these. But no, psychedelics are, as Stanislav Grof put it, who I was lucky enough to study with at CIIS, they're non-specific amplifiers. And as Leary and Richard Alpert Ramdas at Harvard already recognized, set and setting are 99% of what shapes the experience. And so psychedelics are not a silver bullet, and unfortunately, the psychedelic renaissance, which I was shocked to see how quickly our capitalist society all of a sudden decided it was pro psychedelics to some extent, and all this research going on. But it got totally corporatized, and all of a sudden it's psychedelics to microdose at the office so that you're more efficient,
Yeah.
and the trauma focus, like psychedelics as just mental health treatments, is really a domestication of the transformative potential of these things. And so the way that the psychedelic renaissance and all of this new scientific research that's going on is tending to get captured by the mental health frame, I think is profoundly limiting, because what happens then is that there's less of a chance for worldview transformation, and what you end up with is like the VA and the Pentagon being the main funders of MDMA research because they want to get their soldiers healed from PTSD and back out on the battlefield, instead of like, well, like, what about pre-traumatic stress disorder? Like, how do we give this to the generals so that they don't start new wars? That level of integration of the psychedelic experience isn't happening because they're being instrumentalized to serve the existing values of our capitalist civilization. And so, yeah, I have had to disabuse myself of my youthful naivete about the potential of psychedelics. I still think they do have tremendous potential, but only in the right set and setting. You need to do the work of unveiling the assumptions of your existing worldview, thinking through and feeling into an alternative cosmological picture. And then you can integrate these deep psychedelic experiences that might otherwise just leave you totally confused and fragmented and inflated and narcissistic. I've seen a lot of psychedelic narcissism as well. And so I'm not anti-psychedelic by any means, but I'm also, I think, a lot more skeptical of the ways in which psychedelics are being sold back to us by big pharma and by the wellness industries and the mental health frame. I think it's been co-opted. I never would have thought as a 19-year-old that psychedelics could be co-opted, but I think it's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting time for psychedelics, and seeing it get so accepted by the scientific community, but only in this one model, and then the culture is being somewhat fed a certain narrative about it, but they're not being taught another narrative about it, the indigenous narrative, or the awe and the wonder, or the rites of passage and the elders, things like that. It's more like, nope, you need to sit in a therapy office and you need to check certain boxes for trauma, or you can, and it's unbelievable to me. But I've also seen people benefit from them in that setting, so I'm like, I don't want to completely throw the baby out with the bathwater or tell people that it's all bad. I'm just more of like, let's just be critical and question it and not just glorify it and not be able to talk about some of the negatives and the issues, especially with the track record of the pharmaceutical companies and people that are stakeholders in that industry. But I'd love to ask you about your perspective of God and like what Whitehead's perspective is of what we would call God, spirit, things like that, because I think right now it seems like we're in a spiritual crisis, right? It seems like that seems to be the biggest thing that's off the rails in our culture, at least from what I can gather. And right now what I've seen with social media and the engineering of dividing everybody and getting everybody pitted against each other, it seems to be working pretty well. So you get people into these camps, and everybody seems to be fighting about ideology right now. But what do you think about the nature of God, and what do you think as a healthy perspective for humanity to maybe consider adopting? I mean, I know humility goes a long way in admitting that we don't have any clue about the nature of God. At least for me, I'm like, I think humility would go a long way in less righteousness, but I've heard you speak to your perspective on God, and I'd love to hear it now and maybe share that with the audience.
I mean, it's probably the most misunderstood and abused word in all of human history. And so it's almost, it can be almost embarrassing to use it. We just throw it around as if we know what it means.
Mm-hmm.
But that's it, though. It's this way of gesturing towards the encompassing mystery that humbles us. And we can relate to that as something wondrous. You know, the emotion of wonder, I think, is one of the sources of hope that I have, that we could have a future as a species, because if we can get in touch with wonder, you can't be an ideologue anymore. If you're really able to cultivate that sense of amazement at the sheer fact that anything exists at all.
Mm.
And so rather than, I mean, you know, Whitehead has a very sophisticated metaphysics where there's a primordial nature of God and a consequent nature of God, and it's a whole way of conceptualizing what we might mean by that word. And we can get into that if you want to, but I think it's also just important to step back from all of that, attempt to explain what we mean by God, and just to feel that sense of wonder and amazement. And the fact that I exist, that you exist, that any of this exists, is a miracle. And there's no getting behind that to explain it. All we can do is receive it as a gift. And that's not to say that there isn't a lot of suffering, and people might feel that their existence is a punishment. And that's why this gets complicated, because then we can see the ways in which somehow, while that wonder is there as a resource to inspire us, that's not the end of the story. There just seems to be something serious about this, that actually, oh wait, we're supposed to be doing something here. There's some sense of...
What do you mean by that, suppose? Because that word has always come up for me as a should or supposed. I'm curious there.
Well, there's a certain sense of should that we feel as a result of being enculturated in this neoliberal capitalist society, that like, oh, I'm not contributing, or I'm not working hard enough, or I don't make enough money, or I'm not good enough, or this is a what I just said about we're supposed to be doing something here, I think is a deeper layer than that, I hope, which isn't something that would be imposed on us by society or by an economic model or by anyone else. I think each of us feels this deep sense of motivation to express and articulate and create, and to be a part of some larger evolutionary project. And I think that is it's a natural instinct that we have, that we're not satisfied with what already exists, and we feel, I mean, you tell me if this resonates with you at all, but that there's this deep sense that I'm supposed to contribute. I have a gift, a unique gift that only I can express. And if I feel like I'm failing to live up to that potential, that's a source of, it's not just biological suffering, it's spiritual suffering in a sense. And so that need to express and to participate in carrying forward this evolutionary cosmos, I think is where that supposed to or should comes from. Like, we're not just, and, you know, this might be a difference between some forms of spirituality that are more just about like just blow out the candle and dissolve into nirvana as this lack of craving, lack of desire to do anything, because there is no self. So what? And then this more maybe Yeah, it's maybe typically Western kind of idea that no, there's a trajectory here. Like we're supposed to be doing something, and
Mm-hmm.
I think there are ways in which even like within Buddhism, that idea of the release into nirvana gets complexified with, say, like the Bodhisattva's vow, and Buddhism's always oriented toward relieving suffering, whereas this view that I'm talking about is more like there's almost an artistic dimension to it. I think that this desire to create and to be creative and co-create is intrinsic to the nature of the universe, and so it's not a guilt thing so much as a like imposed on us by a judgmental God or a social structure. It seems like something more within ourselves that we feel, at least I feel, compelled to show up and express something that would contribute to the further flowering of this cosmic process.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I
Does
think
that track for you? I mean, how does that?
Oh, definitely. I think it's beautiful and interesting, and I think it resonates. I find myself being curious about that. Like, so if you can look at first principle, to me is like, okay, the awe and the wonder. Wow, thank you. The first relationship to this mystery is like, wow, thank you for, not thank you in the typical Western sense, but like the appreciation for the fact that something's happening from nothing and that I'm having an experience. That's always like my first relationship, which I think is for me, the most healthy thing I could orient towards is gratitude. It's a state, and it always seems to be the first prayer, if you will, to something that you're a part of, the mystery. But then you also, at least in my line of work and in my lifetime with family members and addiction, and you see suffering, right, in the nature of world. So it's not all just blissed out, thank you, let's lay here and get blissed out. It's also like to seek to understand more about the nature of, to seek the truth. The truth is usually harmful and painful too. It's not all beautiful. And so I always say, when you seek the truth and you sort of take that oath to be genuinely curious and to be sincere in your seeking, that means there's grief, and that's okay to feel grief. Usually that's the first half of any really good psilocybin experience, is to feel, and to amplify that component, hopefully. But then to also be grateful for that, To me, it's like, okay, I'm so lucky to have the awareness that there is suffering. But I think creativity for each person is unique and different. And almost like when you were saying that, I was seeing that there's a natural, intuitive desire to express or to be your authentic version of yourself, because no one can do that better than you. And so a lot of that just requires unlearning and unprogramming and finding out what that true vibrational vessel is as an existential being. That would be great if everybody could. I think it was Alan Watts, maybe he quoted someone else, but he said, don't ask what the world needs most, ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs most is more people to come alive. I love that type of expression. And I've heard Jamie Wheel quote, you wake up in the morning and you wonder, you want to savor the world, or do you save it? There's a decision. But there's nothing to save if you can't savor it. So I'm always trying to find the balance of, all right, there's more work to do, not by some deity in the sky that's telling me and shaming me, or society guilting me. But there's always a desire to do more, yet at the same time there's a desire for myself, at least, to just be. Like Sadhguru talks about being a human being and not a human doing. And so I feel like the balance of the two is the thing for me to contemplate, because I'm lucky enough to have an ecosystem that I'm living inside of that is working. And I see people every day that, are in wheelchairs and don't have their faculties, and they're not quite as lucky as I am in so many regards. So there's an obligation to be of service. And I get more out of serving others than I do from anything in life, to be honest. Like when I share breath work with people and help them to slow down and feel, and they leave feeling better, and then they bring their mother back to the next one, and that person gets to connect with their breath on a really basic level. And there's nothing better than making other people feel good or adding value in society, I think. But also when you're creating things like this podcast, I love this podcast. It's not, I won't make any money from it, but I love that I get to talk to you through space-time and then share it when I'm uploading it and doing all of the editing. It's like, I'm so excited that someone's going to get to be exposed to your ideas, you know? And so that drives me too. So I don't know what the should is, but I know what you mean by the deeper, more so-called intrinsic feeling that if you're not doing it, you're suffering, whatever that thing is that you're supposed to be doing. But it doesn't any longer come from the societal norm. And I like that you pointed that out first.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like this is a kind of gloss on Whitehead, that there's these two poles to our experience of reality. There's the feeling pole and the aiming pole, right? So we feel wonder, and we could just be in that. But there's this other pole that we want to aim at intensifying that wonder, perhaps. And so we receive existence as a gift, and then we feel compelled to keep giving, to be ourselves a conduit for further gifting. And suffering seems like it's inevitable, but it's like a function of meeting resistance when we either can't feel as much as we would want to feel because it's painful, because we have some disease or something's malfunctioning, and we can't feel that wonder anymore. We meet resistance, or when we try to aim at further intensification and expression of that, we meet resistance, and so we suffer. But the thing about the meeting resistance is that it allows us to grow. It allows us to deepen and transform and include more if we're able to meet the suffering with consciousness. We can grow through it and become more. We gain more capacity, And so, like, suffering is not just evil. Suffering is what allows us to evolve, And so I think the role of spirituality and even religion here is just to give human beings, who are always going to be at varying levels of being able to, like, think through and understand and seek coherence in these questions, but to give us a sense of orientation, so that we, despite the suffering, continue to lean in and to have some sense that it's worth it. Existing is worth it, even if we're suffering. Mm-hmm. That doesn't, like, we need stories to help us understand why that's the case. And I think the spiritual crisis nowadays is we have all of these forms of short-term gratification and dopamine triggering and whatnot that keeps us distracted from the deeper trauma of not having a coherent story for why we even exist, or what we're supposed to be doing here, other than scrolling and being outraged. And we've lost touch with the cultural means of meaning making, that would allow us to sustain a vibrant, healthy civilization and social life, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to carefully recover some of those means. And a lot of people are rushing to recover forms of religion that are quite archaic, and because we're so desperate for meaning and so desperate for a narrative, I think people reach for what's closest at hand and end up with, like, Christian nationalism, for example, or some form of, very traditional authoritarian, like Catholicism or whatever. Or I think this is a danger, and if we don't find ways of engaging in explicitly as a culture in meaning making, then we're vulnerable to that type of unhealthy, reactionary, regressive form of story making, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like unplugging right now is probably the most important antidote at certain times from this constant feedback loop of algorithms and information. And then I know you've explored this because I believe I've heard you speak to the circadian rhythms and just the basic functions of the biological system that have been completely tampered with through LED lighting and indoor environments and blue lit screens. And I'm very lucky that I can spend most of my waking days outside when I'm at work, and then when I'm off, I spend most of my time outside. Very lucky. But for people that aren't that lucky and they have to work at a hospital or a school or whatever, I feel like the lighting thing is so much more important than we could ever imagine. You know, if you were to try to go, let there be light, and you were to get back to the core principles of what some of the ancient people were talking about, it was pretty much derived from light, and realizing that you are light, and the whole cosmos is pretty much infused with vibration and frequency, and we are not separate from that. So when you start tampering with that on a consistent basis, it can sound woo-woo, but it's not. If you look at evolutionary history and how long we've been in these indoor environments, is a very new experiment, you know?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And, you know, we say nowadays, oh, the sun is just a ball of gas. And it's very easy to dismiss those earlier animist cultures that perceive the sun as some kind of a god. But even just if you're able to maintain that sense of wonder and understand the energy dynamic that between us and the sun, like, this seems more accurate to me actually to think of it as a god, given that it feeds all life on Earth, and that the very atoms, the carbon and phosphorus and all these heavier elements that compose our bodies were created in dying stars. I mean, what more could you ask for in terms of a sacred story? That we are participants in, than to just acknowledge that as meaningful. That's not just a ball of gas. That is in Whitehead's sense, an organism. And in some sense, physically speaking, astrophysically speaking, we exist inside the sun. We're inside the sun's atmosphere, as it were, you know? And so why I think it is actually more accurate to relate to the sun as Helios or Apollo, or, take your pick. We can mythologize it in different ways, but we should be careful with that word. But I think it's actually healthier to recognize that science and myth, like these what's called animism and this scientifically accurate view of the universe, are not as far apart as we might imagine.
Yeah, and I feel like on the practical level, if you can get outside more and connect with nature and your breath, which is the foundation of your life energy, prana, it doesn't require much more for you to then have your own experience without all of the philosophies and different things that people are latching onto that you just described. You can start there first, just unplugging and getting back out to nature and experiencing just the foundational thing that you're a part of. And you're going to feel better just from the medicine that your body creates from that experience, So I love philosophy and I love learning and thinking and contemplating and all this stuff. But at the core level, all the best stuff is free, and it's usually outside, when it comes to feeling better. And that's what I want for people, is to feel better and to also have their ability to discern. Right now everybody's getting pitted against each other, and it seems like there's a huge psyop happening, a psychological warfare to divide and distract. And I just want people to have access to their deeper self, their older self, that maybe more the higher intelligence that we can all, I think, interact with on a regular basis if we give it space.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think there are psyops happening, but I always remember things that Terence McKenna would often challenge some of the grander conspiracy theories by like just reminding us that nobody's actually in control. That top-down idea of how power functions is totally unrealistic. So the good news is, even if there are people, a global cabal of elites trying to control our minds, whatever, their power is limited because the universe is not such that, and the earth and human beings are not such that we could actually be, at the end of the day, finally controlled in that top-down way.
Yeah.
And anyone who's ever worked in an organization or as part of a committee or whatever knows that human beings are just very inefficient at doing anything, much less global conspiracy to control.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Large populations.
There's a delusion of control or an illusion of control. And I think that lack of believing in something bigger, like you don't probably feel that when you die, the lights go out. And so you're not as easily susceptible to the forms of fear and power that people will try to impose upon you, whoever it may be. So, yeah, I think that can be helpful too, is to not be in fear, So
that just brings me right back to, Socrates confronting a court of his fellow Athenian citizens who, convict him of atheism and corrupting the youth and all of that, and that he had that philosophical confidence in a kind of immortality allowed him to not just speak on behalf of what he believed was true, but to die for it without fear. And I think that sort of philosophical confidence is the most powerful form of resistance that we can have against tyranny. Now, you have to be willing to pay the ultimate price,
Yeah.
But I think that's what diffuses the fear tactics that keep us under the control of these nefarious powers, and so how we relate to that threshold of death is very, very important for how our societies end up being organized, and what sorts of threats we allow to control us.
Yeah, I agree. What are some of your favorite works, writing from the past or in the present, that you would refer to people that are curious about the nature of consciousness?
The Gospel of John, the Bhagavad Gita, Mystical Theology by Dionysius the Areopagite. Gosh, this list could go on for a long time. Definitely awesome. Check out more recent stuff. Alan Watts, anything by Alan Watts would be great. It's very accessible. I'll recommend a particular book by him. Two books. One is Beyond Theology for people that have more of a background in religious studies, and the other one, which is just accessible to anyone, even a 12-year-old, I think, would be his book, The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are.
That's my favorite one.
Yeah, it just cuts right
it's
to
the most
core
readable one for him, I think. But what about Steiner? Would you have any favorite Steiner books?
Oh yeah, Rudolf Steiner. It's not an easy book to read unless you have studied some philosophy, but his book, The Philosophy of Freedom, which he published in 1894 before he became like a spiritual teacher and started anthroposophy and all of that. It just really, it's readable, but it's like a meditative practice, because he's trying to direct your attention to the activity of your own thinking and to empower you through that direction of attention inward, to free you from that sense of should, like that to be a moral person means you obey somebody else's law or whatever, to really connect you with that inner sense of who and what you are as a thinking being. And for Steiner, thinking isn't just like abstract concepts or whatever. It's our stream of conscious experience. And from that awareness, he thinks just by becoming aware of our own thinking activity, we come into touch with spirit. And he makes very obvious, I think, the irreducibility of spirit in our direct experience of ourselves. And we take it for granted. We don't notice it. And he's able to, through the course of 18 some odd chapters, really, I think, invite us to cultivate an awareness of ourselves that produces true freedom, right? Not just negative freedom in the sense of, not being imposed upon by a political order, which we still have to deal with the fact if we have a tyrannical government, but the freedom of our spirit, which I think is a crucial birthright that every human being should have the chance to recognize. So I would say philosophy of freedom would be the place to start with Steiner.
Yeah, I have that book, and it's all highlighted and tabbed, and I could read it 10 more times and still learn from it, because each page is so dense. And it's like, yeah, he writes almost like how Nietzsche writes, where it's like, I could probably just sit on this one page for the next 3 months and reread it because it's very, very deep. He's an amazing writer in that way.
Yeah, his book on Nietzsche is good too, Fighter for Freedom.
Cool.
Anyone who's read
that.
some Nietzsche, check out Steiner on Nietzsche. Yeah,
nice. Well, I've had you for your hour and 15 minutes. I'd love to ask all my guests, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
I mean, it sounds like a Hallmark card, but I think it's true. Just love one another.
Hey,
it really is that simple.
I love it. We can use more of that for sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's been really fun. I really appreciate your time, and I'll definitely put all of your stuff in the show notes so people can find your work. It's really amazing. I love that you put so much energy in sharing your work with people. So it's cool.
Thanks, Ryan. It was a really great conversation.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Appreciate you. Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it and subscribe to the show and rate the show. That helps people to discover it. And enjoy the next episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination of some sort.